Welcome. We are in sophomore English, and our objective today, we are on page 688, is to discuss some fundamental elements of poetics. Let's define the term. Poetics, the key elements of a poetic offering. The key elements of a poetic offering. What is the difference between poetry and prose? That's the question we're about to answer. I mean, if you'll think about it, it's just words on the page. What makes some of those words constituted as a poem, and other of those words constituted as a short story, for example? The answer is in the single word, poetics. In other words, poetics is what a poem does. It's kind of what makes a poem a poem. Now, on page 688 and following, they're going to try and give you some insight into just very remedial level poetic theory. We're only scratching the poetic epidermis, if you will. We're only going to say a little bit about poetry and poetics. But we'll look at some poems in the next few days to try to get a sense of what makes this a poem. Okay? Predominantly here, in our levels of reading, we're working at level 2B. The rhetorical, or in the case of poetry, the poetic level of reading. In other words, what exactly is it that makes this poem? Now I'm going to use a kind of plebeian word, a layman's word here, but it works, I think, for us as poets. What makes the poem work? Like, what makes it work? Like, why do we look at the poem and we go, wow, that's kind of interesting? That's kind of the question we'll be asking. But we can ask it on a number of levels. When we look at a poem, we're fundamentally looking at two things. One, the way it looks. Two, the way it reads. Simple, right? So when we're looking at the way the poem lays on the page, we're talking about form. Form. Okay? How many lines does it have? How many stanzas does it have? You know, this kind of thing. Now, your hymnal is going to break up this topic into two parts. They're going to talk about form in terms of traditional form, and then form in what your textbook will call organic form. Now, I'm assuming you have both of those already written down. Let's give a quick definition. What do I mean when I use traditional form? What does that mean? Anyone want to throw out an answer on this one? What is the traditional form of a poem? Ms. Myers?
It kind of follows the rules.
We can say it that way, a pattern or a rule. In other words, if you're playing the game of sonnet writing, you are writing a poem of how many lines? Right, 14 lines. Well done. So in other words, if you're going to play the game of a sonnet, you can't go 13, you can't go 15, you got to go 14. These are just rules. They are, let's be fair, self-imposed to some degree. So, for example, the great Italian sonneteer Petrarch played the game. I'm going to go 14 lines. But there's more to it than just lines if you're working with sonnet writing. For example, if you're working with Shakespeare, the Elizabethan sonnet, we're not only going 14 lines, we have a certain kind of rhyme scheme. We have a certain kind of rhythm within the line, what we will call iambic pentameter. Well, don't worry, we'll talk about all of this in detail so that you can kind of immediately recognize it when you see it, or rather we should say when you hear it, right? Okay. What is then organic form? Jot down in your notes what that one is. What is organic form? Is it the opposite, would you say, of traditional form? How would you qualify organic form?
No rhyme scheme, no pattern.
It's going to be the opposite of predictable, isn't it? Right. In other words, it's going to be playing the game of rule breaking. I mean, that's an easy way to think of it. So when, for example, we stumble across the great Walt Whitman, we'll recognize the ways in which he will play the game of traditional poetic form, but we'll also recognize the ways in which he completely leaves it. Now, of course, models here help us tremendously, don't they? So, for example, under traditional, we might say something like, "Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal," and so on and so on. Of course, here I'm referencing at 3A. What am I referencing? I'm referencing
Psalm of Life.
Psalm of Life by? Do I have anyone to win the all-expenses-paid trip to Basin, Wyoming?
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Longfellow, there you go. Longfellow, Psalm of Life. Of course, we can point out that there is in traditional form, you see on 689, I intentionally quoted Psalm of Life. Why? On 689, Come on, Miss Ermintrout. Why would I quote Longfellow's Psalm of Life? Ah, there we go. So we also have another Longfellow offering. When you want to think about the traditional poet, Longfellow serves rather nicely. Of course, I said it that way, didn't I? Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. But I could have done it differenter, huh? I could have gone, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Na 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 na. I won't go on because Costalis will then not be able to sleep tonight. That, of course, is a part of what we will consider in poetic elements. Let's go to page 690 now and work there. The first concern for us will be what they will call sound devices. Now, what we mean here poetically is that this is the way the poem sounds when it is read out loud or recited. And I was just playing that game of rhythm. Na, 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 right? Okay, by the way, we should point out, and I think I've said this already, if you, kind of laugh at that implied rhythm, I would challenge you to write much poetically using that kind of rhythm. Of course, Longfellow writing all of Song of Hiawatha using that rhythm, and we're talking tens of thousands of lines of poetry, right, that he would write over a career where he would play that game. Notice as well that we've got issues of meter as we are playing the game. A certain kind of rhythm, na, 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 is a certain kind of meter. Do you see the word scanning there? Now, that's an important word for us. When we use that term, we mean to talk about the accents or the unaccented parts of a word or a line, right? So as we pay attention, for example, here, Shelley's dirge is offered, rough wind, that moon is loud, grief too sad for song. You can kind of see that there's a certain kind of ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. Now, you're going to pay attention if you are into music at all, and most of us are on some level, whether we play, perform, or we just listen. We're going to have a sense of the musical quality of the poetic line, and we'll pay attention here. Notice there's some other sound devices mentioned. You should have them in your notes, the 4 provided there. We'll see examples of all of this. Repetition, break, 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 for example. Or assonance. What did you just call me? Assonance, you see. So here we can see assonance. Repetition of what?
Vowel.
Yeah, vowel sounds. So you can see that the opportunity there. Alliteration. What is it to be alliterative in our poetic offerings? Yeah, we're kind of playing that game of Peter Piper picked a pail of pickled peppers and all of that, right? That's alliterative. What is consonance?
Oh, like anything.
Right, we're repeating consonant sounds, not vowel sounds, right? That's consonants. Now, they're going to give you a couple of models over here on 691 in regards to rhythm and rhyme. Let's jump over to 692 because I now am running, short on time. Imagery and figurative language. Now, these are poetic elements that we clearly want to pay attention to. Some of you will say, dude, they already taught us this when we were freshmen. Why do we have to learn it again? I would say as a sophomore, we began to simply amplify on hopefully what you already were introduced to as freshmen. Under imagery and figurative language, because we're sophomores, we'll only stick with 4, and they're the 4 most basic, and there they are at the bottom of the page on 692. We can have, within a poem, the use of the simile, which of course looks like the word smile with an extra letter, yes? Simile, we're talking about a comparison where the poet will use one of 2 words, either what? The word like or the word as. So for example, we can say that he is like an oak tree, okay? If I say that about a guy, what do I mean? He is like an oak tree. So we have any number of, right, he's probably big and strong and those kinds of things, right, okay, right, right. What is then the difference between simile and metaphor?
are.
It's interesting that Soph would respond that metaphor is like. So in other words, she gave me a simile to tell me what a metaphor is. That's outstanding. Well done. Yes, that's good. And of course, we use the word like a lot, don't we? We seem to speak in constant similes when we start using. It's kind of like that's, we play that like game. Metaphor is to make the comparison without the use of the word like or as. So in other words, he is an oak tree. Now we understand that we're not being literal here. We're being rather, the language is right there at the top of the page, 692, figurative. Okay? In other words, we're not being literal, we're being figurative. Of course, personification is to say he is an oak tree to some degree. When we personify, we give inanimate objects human traits. So if I talk about the fingernails of Ruthie's tree, you can understand that I might be gesturing towards the leaves on Ruthie's tree, right? Okay. Or if I were to talk about the skeleton of Ruthie's tree, you could kind of guess that maybe I'm speaking of, the bark or something. See, the metaphor is going to bring one-to-one correspondence without the use of like or as. Okay? Finally, that's a funny-looking word, hyperbole. Now, what is a hyperbole? For a poet to be hyperbolic means what? I'm so hungry I could eat a bear is, for most of us at least, hyperbolic. It's hyperbole. In other words, it's exaggeration. Some of us are hungry enough to eat a bear, and so to that degree, I suppose it's not so hyperbolic. Finally, they will give you some models on 693 of the imagery, and then off we go now to spend a bit of time looking at actual poems. Let's go ahead now and look on 698, since it's part of our annotated process. Let's look at 698 and the Teasdale offering, There Will Come Soft Rains. Now again, because I'm helping Team Bers to get on board with this whole annotative process thing, what we ask of you is that you think about annotation in kind of 3 steps. Okay? Step 1, what you do before you come to class. In other words, you're going to do some reading outside of room 303. Okay? We call that pre-class annotations. You do that on your own. Then, step 2, what we do in class. This we call in-class annotations. Here, we're looking for fundamentally 2 things in our in-class notes. 1, what we call match information. Anytime the instructor or anyone else says something we already have written down. Because we want to make these distinctions, we will do our pre-class notes in red ink and our in-class notes in blue or black ink. Does that make sense? So that, for example, while an observation is made in class that you've already got written down, there's no reason to write it down again. So let's say, for example, that the information I was just covering, that you already had written down hyperbole. Mr. McGee mentions it. Now, I wrote it down in red ink, if I did my annotations correctly. Now I am marking with blue or black ink that Mr. McGee observed something about hyperbole. What are the odds? Part 3 of our annotative process. What are the odds it might end up on the exam? That's called exam prep. If the textbook says it and the instructor mentions it, what are the odds it might end up on the exam? They're pretty high, right? So one of the things we'll do in exam prep is to go back and kind of look at the number of places that we made those observations. The other thing we're doing in in-class notes, along with match information, is anything new. That's the reason why we normally will draw a line down the page, and we will use the right-hand side of the line for any new information, information you didn't have written down on the left-hand side of the line. All right, so let's now look at the annotative process. We, again, ask 3 questions. What does the text say? What does the text mean? How does the text relate? So let's now go through this Teasdale poem real quickly, and let's maybe do a little bit of annotative work, shall we? For some of you, this will be kind of like doing pre-class annotations in class, and for others of you, you'll be working with blue or black ink because you've already got an annotation that you tried on this one. Teasdale suggests the following. There will come soft rains, and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pool singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white. Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire, and not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly. And spring herself, when she woke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone. Now, I believe, Team Ayers, we exegeted this text in our conversations earlier in semester 1. But let's look at it nonetheless again and prove how brilliantly a well-written text can draw or solicit new insights for us, especially maybe we might say at 3A, where we've been exposed to a number of texts since our last conversation with this text. Dare I say it, we could pull out Romeo and Juliet and go back to work again and find a whole bunch of information we missed the first time, right? Because we are, of course, a bit more mature and we've read a little bit more, been exposed to a little bit more. Let's begin, first of all, though, at 2B and make some observations about the form of the poem. See, we can go right back to some of the intel we were working with a few moments ago. Do you wish to consider this poem an example of traditional or organic form? It is to some degree traditional. You have a fairly predictable kind of arrangement of lines. What do we call those two lines together alone? Does anyone know what that stanza formation is called? It's a couplet. Very good. That's right, because we have two lines, a couple of lines together. So notice Teasdale's going to play a game of juxtaposing couplets. How many stanzas? How many stanzas?
11.
Well, that's easy because all you got to do is ask how many lines and divide by 2. See how that works? It's kind of easy, isn't it, right? Notice that we have some nice symmetry or balance going on here, but notice that her lines will run different lengths stanza by stanza. Notice within the stanzas, she's trying most of the time to play the game of either going directly the same number of syllables, varying the number of syllables, or the length of the line, we might say. Let's play the game at level 1 now. What does this poem actually say? And then we'll go to level 2A and we'll ask, what does this poem mean? Like, what's the point of a poem like this? We'll begin at level 1. This poem suggests what? Notice tense. I'll begin to try for you, Team Ayers, to make some observations that, please forgive, Mr. McGee is an old man and I may have forgotten, but I don't think some of these comments were made in the last observation of the poem. Notice the tense. There will come soft rains. Notice the final stanza, and spring herself when she woke at dawn would scarcely know that we were gone. Notice how Teasdale plays interesting games with tense. At first we feel future, tense. Somewhere in the future a war is coming, and spring will look backwards and not care at all. And then we have some sense of past tense. Way in the future, looking backwards. What will it be like when Worland High School stands, but there's no students to attend? It will just be an empty structure, dilapidated and falling. There will still be birds, though, singing in Ruthie's tree. Teasdale seems to suggest about those birds and their concern about the absence of students at Worland High School. What will those birds do? Go, oh, good heavens, I wonder where all this... No. What does Teasdale suggest about those birds?
Keep singing.
Just keep singing, right? They won't even notice our absence. What's disturbing about that observation? Let's jump to 2A real quickly. What is disturbing? What's the point of a poem like this? What is she trying to say about the relationship between humans and the rest of life species on this planet? Any ideas?
How little importance they have on the planet.
We have the word insignificant, don't we, come to mind, right? Insignificant. What is insignificant? Humans and our fond attempts to do what?
Take over.
Yeah, take over or control the world, right? Notice all the animals mentioned. Did you see this at level 1? In the first stanza, animals and nature, we might say, right? We have rains, the smell of the ground, the swallows. Why do we keep having birds in this poem? And notice that we will have feathery fire?
Because they're considered the most free creatures.
Yeah, we think of them as free, right? They fly anywhere they wish. They go anywhere they want. Her view of these swallows flying, these birds flying. What do you find interesting about feathery fire? Jot that one down in your notes. Of course, at 2B, what game are we playing with feathery fire? Uh-oh, we're back to Peter Piper picked a pail of pickled peppers. What do we call that? That's alliterative, isn't it, right? Feathery fire is clearly alliterative. But what's interesting about feathery fire? Anyone want to take a guess at why that's interesting? Feathery fire? What do you think she's really meaning with feathery fire? I mean, let's not worry about the figurative side of it yet. How can birds' feathers look like they're on fire? What bird can look like it's on fire because of its feathers?
Phoenix.
The phoenix comes to mind brilliantly. Let's write that one down because you're absolutely right. Tistow's playing a game with us from the mythic side, isn't she, with the whole notion of the phoenix. The bird that does what? Gets old,
Burns up.
and then it builds its little nest, goes into fire, right? And out of the ashes arises what? The new, that's right, the new bird, yes, okay. We'll clearly understand that. But wait a minute, you missed it. Because if I were to ask a bunch of third graders what bird most looks like it's on fire just by looking at its... the problem for many of us is that we've not seen the cardinal, have we? Right? If you've seen a cardinal, you know that a cardinal is a bird that is predominantly red, very red, beautifully red, on fire red.
Wait, but not all fire is red.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. See, we can continue to play the game. What's significant about fire, though, Miss Myers?
Burns.
No. What's significant figuratively about the use of the word fire?
It's
Shows a
destruction.
lot of emotion.
It does bring about destruction. Keep going. What is it that we hear is the reason there are no humans in our poem?
The war, we've destroyed it.
The word war comes to mind, doesn't it? Right. Human beings have found a way to build enough bombs to blow themselves up in war. We've burned ourselves up, and the birds don't seem to care. Go to the last stanza. Spring is capitalized. What do you make of that? We are personifying spring, aren't we? Outstanding. We are personifying spring as a individual, male or female? Interesting. The suggestion maybe is men build the bombs to fight the wars to blow us up. Spring is the female that rolls her eyes and says, really? Again you have to do this? And a few million years later we'll start all over and again we have to? Seriously. You would think you males could figure out a way to resolve your conflict better than beating the snot out of each other. All kinds of little obvious ways to play this game. Well, come back tomorrow and we'll play some poetic games again. Thank you.